Hello, welcome to Teaching Artistry with Courtney J. Boddie. That's me. This is a podcast that celebrates artists and advocates for community engagement. And this is We Can't Go Back, a video series in partnership with Creative Generation meant to examine, interrogate, and confront racist policies and systems in the arts. This series amplifies leaders in the arts and culture who drive radical change in communities through anti-racist and liberatory practices. Subscribe to the Teaching Artistry with Courtney J. Boddie YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I live in Brooklyn on the stolen lands of the Lenape and Canarsie nations. I identify as a Black, cisgendered woman, and I would like to uplift and pay respect to my ancestors from across the African diaspora, stolen from their native lands and within the US. I also pay respect and uplift the indigenous diaspora that are woven into my history and DNA through a network of solidarity and love from the Cherokee, Creek, and Uchi nations. Now, let's welcome our guest, C. Brian Williams. Hi, Brian.
Hey, how are you? Nice to see you, Courtney.
Nice to see you too. Welcome.
Good to be here. Thank you for that beautiful acknowledgement.
Thank you. So, Brian, can you let everybody know what is your role in arts and or arts education, and how do you embed anti-racism practices into your work?
You know, I started Step Afrika over 25 years ago, and Step Afrika is the first professional company in the world dedicated to the art form of stepping. And for me, arts and arts education practice is really woven into the very fiber of the organization. It's really a part of who we are. I always say that we love performing on stages, but it's the work that we do in communities with children that is, equally important to the company. So when I think about, the times that we find ourselves in now and trying to build and working to build a much better society and world, I think about what Step Afrika has done and what I've been trying to do, which is to create space for opinions and people that there wasn't space before. And so that's something that I'm really focused on, making sure that I bring forth the histories and culture of African-American people in this country in particular, and seeing the results of that work, because I think by knowing more, we can clearly do better. So that's really what my main goal is through our work right now.
Before we started recording, we had a nice lengthy conversation, and I was telling you how the last production that was presented at the New Victory, Drum Folk, really had a profound impact on me and the audiences. But you told a beautiful story about that piece with older audiences. Would you mind sharing that?
So Drum Folk is a work that Step Afrika has really been working its entire existence to create. I'll tell just a little bit of background for you. The reason we wanted to do Drum Folk was when I first learned how to step, and stepping, for those who don't know, is a tradition created by African-American fraternities and sororities. It's like a cultural ritual practice that we have to celebrate these organizations. But if you would ask a member of a fraternity or sorority where stepping came from, there wouldn't be a very strong answer. They wouldn't really know the history, or it would be something generic like it comes from Africa. So Step Afrika, I personally was not satisfied with that answer. So I started to do a little research, and that's where we came to know about the Stoner Rebellion of 1739 and the Negro Act of 1740. And we can talk about those more. But those movements and those moments in history were very transformative for not just African Americans, but America in general. So Drum Folk draws inspiration from that history. So when we shared this history in a performance with some elders, and this is like the over, I don't want to age anybody, let's say the over 80 crew. I'll never forget it because we were in workshop for the production well before we would come to New Victory Theater and other theaters across the country. And it felt like it was like the theater became like this huge church almost. And it was primarily African-American audience, like I said, well over the age of 70, well over that age. And the way they resonated and connected with that work was something I'll never forget. And Step Afrika will look forward to bringing that work and really targeting those communities even more aggressively in the years to come, because that's why we build it, you know?
Yeah, I mean, just to go down that line, I have another question, but I'm going to ask you a question about Drum Folk, actually, in what you talked about in terms of the way that you're working to use histories and weave art, performing arts into the telling of those histories.
Mm-hmm.
And the kind of research that we had to do to create education materials for around that particular production. It was hard. It was hard to read the articles, and there were, I don't know, like something like over 40 articles or something like that in the act itself of Step Afrika. And to read them with this awful language.
Yeah.
And the idea of policing Black bodies into almost every single act or article within the act.
Mm-hmm.
And I could see parallels between what was written in this act to today, exactly.
Yes.
So my question I usually ask here is about artists feeling emboldened and empowered within their own journeys to forge the future of arts and arts education that is fiercely anti-racist. And to punctuate that's my question. But to punctuate that, to me, is that work that we had to do that was natural to the model of our programming really impacted me as a Black woman.
Yeah.
And illuminated quite a few things for myself as I'm on my own journey.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious about, what are the discussions that you all have? I work for a predominantly white institutions. You are not. So how are artists who are either of color or not of color, BIPOC or white identifying, how can we embark on this journey or deepen this journey?
Well, we got to start by learning the history. And I think that's what this moment for me is about going forward. I mean, Step Afrika has been very aggressive with trying to share parts of American history that just have not been magnified or shared as much as they should, like transformative events in American history that just have been kind of just whitewashed to some degree and just looked over. And so we want to bring those stories forward. And the idea is that when we bring the stories forward, all of us, of all backgrounds, just learn more about what has happened in this country. And, and I personally know that there's still so much learning for me to do about indigenous communities in the country and Latinx communities and that particular story. Why don't we do a better job of teaching these lessons? So as an artist, you have to choose your lane to some degree, or you have to choose what you can focus on, because if not, you can't, I feel that you can't deliver an effective message. So for me, this moment in history, I was like, why do so few people know about these American activists in 1739 fighting for freedom and liberty even before the Boston Tea Party? And why don't we celebrate their efforts at protest? And then you have to look at what protest has done to America in general. And I'm no expert on this, but it'd be a great conversation about the history of protests in society. And whenever you hear protests, people are like, well, no more protests or don't do this. But when we look at what protest does for the country, it really pushes us forward, and it's almost like essential. So I'm very thankful to these young people that have been in the streets and marching and leading these protests and staying at it, because they have made a huge effect, and that all Americans will benefit from when we, come out of this.
Do you think that we'll come out of this?
Well, I'll say that we'll come out of the immediacy of it, right? So, and we'll, because like you say, like we can't turn back, and you're absolutely right. This is a moment where I do think we'll come out of COVID. I'm praying that we'll come out of COVID, so that when we come back out of that shelter in place, quarantine, and the things that affected people's lives so much in terms of movement, I don't want to come back to the same space. I want to come back to a more freer, a more open, a definitely more open, equitable space. And I think that the path has been set for us to do that.
Yeah, and speaking about protest and democracy, it's reminding me of the 1619 Project and how the posit is that through protest and movements from Black Americans or Black Africans here, that throughout our history, that's been a part of trying to make the words that are in the Constitution actually ring true.
Of course.
Yeah.
And we've been trying for a long time. Like I read Frederick Douglass's speech that he made on the 4th of July. I think he made on the 5th of July back in late 1800s. And I was like, goodness, this, you know, that's what's so crazy. It's not a new battle. It's an old battle. But we haven't studied it and it hasn't been shared how aggressively folks have been battling. You know, did you hear about Dolly Parton? Hey, that's so funny I'm bringing up Dolly Parton. But she said something, she said something interesting about Black Lives Matter and her response, which was wonderful, but she called it innocent ignorance. And I was like, You know, that's where you start to deal with the difference between individual and systemic. And I think what this moment is fighting is systemic inequality. Individuals may feel like they may not have that, but we operate in this historically inequitable system. And now we can finally say that no one can say they're ignorant to that fact. And that's huge. For me, that's huge. We can acknowledge that this is what it is. And then we can start, because once you acknowledge, then we can start to say, okay.
My brain went to the fact that there is a representative of GOP representative that has written a bill that would make teaching the 1619 Project in schools illegal, which is ridiculous. Anyway, so that's where my brain went. But
I heard about that.
But I think that's where, you know, between that and the whitewashing that you were talking about, and the fact that Step Afrika is looking to bring forward these transformative moments in history that have huge resonance on where we are today, that's an interesting project, I think, whether it's individual or it's something that happens as a collective, in looking at these moments and what can we learn from them, what as artists can we glean from them, and thinking from an abolitionist point of view to what you were saying around Dolly Parton, who doesn't love Dolly Parton?
Gotta love Dolly.
Right, I mean, come on. But that idea of that individualism versus the collective. We're experiencing that right now, right? There are, somebody said in a previous interview that we are experiencing, I might not be threading correctly, but this is where my brain is going, so follow along, shall we? But, you know, we're in this moment of the results or outcomes from eugenics, the science of studying, you know, people who believe, who are white identifying, who believe that they are better without having to work at anything. And to the point where, like, science is actually not, like, I know more than the scientists know, like people who actually study shit. Really? So there's a lot of work to be done, and the thing that I think I have found really interesting, and I'm sort of getting us to the next thing, in terms of I'd love to learn from you around maybe not the artist part, but the institutional piece of like, what are some real concrete actions that institutions can be taking to dismantle, restructure, dissolve, break oppressive policies and systems that are like white supremacy constructs are really woven into?
Well, this is something that I think about a lot as we move through this. I deal a lot with, in my work, trying to build strong institutions. I think with this pandemic and then The highlight on historic inequities has kind of revealed, and it's been in all this stuff, conversation about business ownership and the arts. And it's one thing to transform institutions from within, and we talked about that, and that's important. How can predominantly white institutions better respond? But I'm also of the mind where how do we also just have a stronger ecology of arts organizations that are equally are equitably represented in the sphere? Because let's look at Washington, D.C., which is where Step Afrika is based. Step Afrika is now the largest organization of color in the region, in DMV. But we're still a very small organization, about $2.5 million annually. So there's this very clear ceiling in terms of our capacity to grow to scale. So I still only have 4 to 5 administrative people and full-time artists. So the question is, what are those historic inequities and structural inequities that have kind of prevented the growth of the organizations that we need? Why don't we have a thriving Black theater company in the city? What is going on in the structure that hasn't allowed those organizations to prosper? So that's what I'm starting to look at, really. What are those institutional barriers that exist? Because we need to have strong institutions to anchor the community as well. We can't just be relying on individuals transforming elsewhere. How can these institutions also respond to the issue? And that's what I'm trying to do. Like just last thing I'll say, Step Afrika's role in this is, like, we employ 14 artists of color full time, and we've been very dedicated to keep them employed through this period. That's really hard to do, but you have to have an institution to support the individual artists. So I know I'm kind of getting off there, but I am about building BIPOC institutions that are strong and equitable out of this moment.
I'm not as knowledgeable about the philanthropic community, but I am clear that the structures of boards and the structure of funding and philanthropy is deeply problematic in terms of white supremacist culture and power hoarding and sort of the quantity over quality issue or construct. And so I don't have an example of what you're talking about, which I think is really, really interesting. I just also want to say, I feel like those who I know in this field, regardless of where they are, Black women especially, but Black, Indigenous, people of color, how much giving I find people still are doing in this moment, even though they are feeling exhausted and
still supporting
and harmed and re-traumatized, certainly for many people. And yet this fight we talked about earlier, there is heart there. There's like revolutionary love through all of that, right? And radical love is a practice, right? So it's not soft and gushy and like coddling. It really is like, I'm gonna point out that this is a problem because I love you. And I love the field and I love the communities that we work with. And I'm doing this because of the communities and the individuals within that community who look like me, who are me. If institutions who are predominantly white-led, we'd like to recenter or decenter whiteness and recenter in terms of programming BIPOC artists and stories and representation, then what is one thing that they could do that is about your idea that I love about building up the ecology and the equity around institutions that are BIPOC led?
There's a couple of things, and this is something we're actually exploring in DC right now with some of the largest predominantly white-led organizations about what contributions they can make. The arts field is a hard field regardless. Anyone who's in the arts knows how hard it is to support and manage arts organizations, no matter what the size is. I don't care how big you are, how small you are, it's still a lot of work to survive in this field. And what I try to share though with my my peers who are leaders of organizations maybe predominantly white-led, is that if you think it's difficult as a leader of a major white theater, I want you to imagine how much more difficult it is in this current society for a person of color, right? Funding opportunities are so different. The individual fundraising opportunities are so different. And a lot of talk has been happening in the country now about the racial wealth gap and how the great disparities between wealth in white communities versus black communities. And, you know, those stats affect other parts of ecology as well. So I feel that concrete actions that larger institutions can do is look at partnerships with arts organizations of color. Meaningful, long-term, not transactional partnerships, multi-year partnerships that talk about space, mentorship, capacity building. And then here's the real word, donor sharing and exchange. Because if you look at individual donors and the gifts that happen, you can see that they say that organizations of color get less than 5, less than 10, well under 10% of their annual budget from individual fundraising. The larger, predominantly white organizations, that number shoots up like 50% or something very significant. So how do we get to start supporting and distributing those resources a little more equitably, right? Those gifts could be transformational for our organizations and allow them to be more stronger, and long-term partnerships will do that too. So that's what I want to see. That's what I'm hoping will happen in DC. We're going to try it, getting to work on that now, actually. And let's see what happens. And I hope to see this replicate. Hope we'll come up with something that works. Because I want to see stronger arts institutions, BIPOC institutions. I don't want to see us kind of hobbling along while, let's say, the theaters that do Shakespeare and the ballets are dominating the funding scene. I want to see us raise, like the Crossroads Theater in New Jersey. So many challenges, but excellent work and amazing history.
Amazing work, yes.
So what happened there? I mean, and it's not just always mismanagement. That's what I think the conversation can finally stop. Sometimes it's not management. It's structural inequities that make it incredibly difficult for groups to survive in this structure that we have. So that's what we're trying to change.
I might be fangirling for a second. I'm sorry. So because I love what you just said. So let's keep going. Let's keep going with this last question around imagining, like, okay, we've got a more equitable ecosystem.
Yeah.
What does a liberated, racially just world, whether it's in the arts or in general, what does it look like?
It's so hard to imagine because we're so bogged down in the structure that we have created. And it almost makes you, kind of perpetually settle for less. So I wonder if it's about the aspirations of the next generation would feel no limit, would feel that the structure is built to support and maintain each and every one of us versus this implicit bias you think you get when you deal within the society. So I wouldn't personally assume as a Black man that if a white police officer stops me, it might be a problem. Or I wouldn't assume that if I raise my voice, that it wouldn't be just I'm angry about a point, but I'm an angry Black man. Or as a Black woman, that if I'm assertive in how I feel, that it's not that I'm angry, it's just that I'm asserting a belief and perspective. And can we get away from labeling parts of our community as angry? And because that kind of silences us a little bit. So I would think less silence, more openness, so that, but it's going to be hard because we've been in this for a long time. And it's going to take a while for even us to free up and really speak, So I think that's one step for me. And I think that to your people who may be listening, when they enter the room, it's kind of a tough conversation to have, and you're sitting in the room and about these labels that have been passed down. I think about Serena Williams sometimes and the challenges she talked about as a Black woman in the healthcare industry and how she would say, I'm hurting, It wasn't responded to the same way. That, oh no, you'll be all right. You're strong. I mean, what are you saying? No, I'm hurting. And it wasn't heard the same way as, say, if a white woman had said that. And that's what I love to see, how we strike that down so that people can just be heard as humans, and we erase all these valuations we place on people that have nothing to do with their humanity or whatever.
There's so many theories around like the delicacy of white women and how Black women are so strong, and that is true, that Black women are strong, but we're also not infallible.
No.
We feel pain, and we feel, and the fact that we are not heard when we say we are in pain.
Yeah.
That bias is, and that happens for many people of color.
It does, and I don't think and that's a huge injustice, because it's not allowing us to be exactly, just to be human.
Yeah.
You have to kind of portray this superhuman quality and this assumption of just not feeling anything, and that's just not. That's a hard one to fix.
Yeah,
Learning about the history, shared history, not having this innocent and ignorance about other people's cultures and experience, to really come into the space ready to hear all stories and conversations.
We could talk forever. I could talk to you forever.
Yeah, I know. This is good.
But I'm gonna leave it there, I think. Yeah. If there's any last comments you'd like to leave before we say our final goodbyes.
No, I just say thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for your work. Step Afrika has come to your place of work, beautiful New Victory Theater, several times, and what you have done with our productions, first the Migration on Reflection of Migration, and second Drum Folk, and sharing it with so many students. I'm really appreciative of that. I want to just thank you for that, and teaching also me in Step Afrika about this work of arts education and taking theater into the schools, because that's where the real impact is, and into communities as well. So thanks for that, and I look forward to working with you again.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm quite humbled by what you just said. And thank you for your beautiful work. Thank you for having this really interesting conversation with me and the audience. And thank you all for watching Teaching Artistry with Courtney J. Boddie. This conversation is definitely going to be on the audio podcast. That platform is SoundCloud, or you can subscribe to Apple Podcasts or wherever you get or listen to your podcasts. And Brian said it, I'm going to say it, we won't go back, can't go back. Onwards.
Now is my time to shine. When your time comes, don't postpone it. When others doubt and out, you don't condone it. Truth be told, yourself is your toughest opponent. When your moment comes, grab hold and own it. Never let go, stand tall and hold tight. Overcoming obstacles is the objective in life. Doubters all the night, and unto them you shine bright. Cause inside your head, on goes the light. Ignite.